Aurora Linnea is a writer, artist, librarian, women's shelter worker, rape crisis counsellor, and eco-feminist pariah living in Portland, Maine. That must be pretty uncomfortable. Over to you.
Thank you. And I would also like to say that I'm speaking today on behalf of myself as well as Cheryl Kleinman, who is my co-writer here with me as well. She's sitting there. Okay. Once there was a women's health movement in the United... Can you hear me? We're good? Okay. I'll try. Once there was a women's health movement in the United States. It was feminist and it was political. This was in the late 1960s and 70s when the poet Adrienne Rich wrote, "The woman's body is the terrain on which patriarchy is erected." Feminists of that era, like Rich, understood that women's liberation would never be achieved if women continued to be denied the most fundamental freedom, that of bodily autonomy. Seizing female bodies back from men's control thus became a movement priority. Male-dominated medicine was identified as an institution of patriarchy culpable in the violation of women's bodies and bodily freedoms, and feminists began to organize against it. In Boston, a feminist collective published what would become the canonical women's health guide, Our Bodies, Ourselves, while in Los Angeles, women met in self-help groups to teach one another how to use a speculum, flashlight, and mirror to glimpse into the previously forbidden territory of their own female interiors. In Chicago, before 1973's Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision legally protected abortion in the U.S., feminists trained themselves to perform the then outlawed procedure, operating an underground abortion service they called Jane. Feminist-run women's health centers opened in cities from Atlanta to Seattle, providing affordable and anti-sexist health care, as well as health education to help women assume greater control over our bodies, our sexuality, and our health, and therefore over our lives as women under patriarchy. Black women, Latina women, and Indigenous American women across the country organized to address the ways that race and sex-based social inequalities intertwined to produce poor health, and rallied to raise awareness within the feminist movement of reproductive injustices that were racist as well as sexist, such as the systematized sterilization of women of color. Women individually and collectively drew upon their own experiences with the healthcare system to advance a concerted challenge against the medical establishment at all levels, from their own personal physicians to the American Medical Association, from pharmaceutical companies to the Food and Drug Administration, and even Western medical science itself as ideology and institution. Women's efforts persisted through the 1980s and 90s, but faced with an increasingly conservative political environment, the movement was steadily sapped of its initial feminist dynamism. Women's health centers accepted state funding and promptly shifted their focus from feminist opposition to patriarchy to the politically safer business of professionalized service provision. Other clinics closed due to the coupling of decreased funding and an increased demand for services, as welfare cuts catalyzed an upswell in women's poverty, or they closed because anti-abortion protesters threatened to set their facilities on fire and murder their staff. While some organizations retained their activist orientation and feminist zeal for radical social transformation, notable examples would include Breast Cancer Action or the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. By the 2000s, the women's health movement had subsided into relative quiescence, supplanted by a deluge of corporate-sponsored pink ribbons and entreaties to eat right and exercise, ask your doctor if insert name-brand drug here is right for you, donate to Planned Parenthood, and attend to your regularly scheduled pap smear or mammogram like a responsible, good girl patient should. Yet the need for organized political resistance to the forces that threaten our health and our capacity to determine the course of our lives as women is as urgent today as it ever was. In the United States, 58 new laws restricting abortion have been enacted thus far in 2019, which, when added to the hundreds of such restrictions enacted over the last decade, along with the 1976 Hyde Amendment, which prohibited Medicaid funds from being used towards abortion costs, these things together make the safe termination of an undesired pregnancy the stuff of fantasy for millions of women. The current administration is also working to eliminate federal programs that provide affordable birth control and basic health services for poor women, as well as to defund comprehensive sex education. The US boasts the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world. It is the only industrialized nation where that rate is rising. Maternity is a particularly perilous undertaking for Black women, who die in childbirth at 3 times the rate of white women. Women in the US have a 1 in 8 chance of developing breast cancer, and it is poor women and Black women who most frequently die from that disease. Women can still expect to outlive our male peers, but we ought not presume that those extra years will be healthy ones. Women report poorer health overall compared to men. We are hospitalized more often and experience higher rates of debilitating chronic illnesses. Diseases that are more common among women than men, such as autoimmune disorders, are increasingly prevalent, yet remain under-researched, with many medical professionals doubting their legitimacy altogether, precisely because they are women's diseases. Women seeking medical care are routinely dismissed as hysterical females, their pain is discounted, and they are advised by their physicians to get pregnant, lose weight, or visit a psychiatrist. Women are, on that note, 2 times more likely than men to be prescribed mind-altering psychiatric medications. Women in the United States are sick, we are miserable and narcotized. Men's violence against us is a major cause of mortality and morbidity among women across demographics. Male dominion makes women sicker by the day. Suicide rates for girls as young as 10 are on the rise, climbing more rapidly than rates for boys. Our prognosis is bleak. The situation is an emergency, and still, the women's health movement remains dormant. How do we account for our contemporary complacency? Some portion of the blame can be placed on the triumph of neoliberal ideology. Endemic neoliberalism has deprived U.S. women of the tools to conceive of women's health in any but individualistic terms. We have wellness initiatives prioritizing lifestyle choices and self-care practices, which are ubiquitous and lay the emphasis squarely on each woman's individual responsibility to administer to her own personal health and happiness. Even the discourse around a health issue is patently political, as abortion today sounds like a neoliberal mantra: choice, choice, choice. This kind of short-sighted individualism immobilizes collective action as our energies are consumed in the never-ending project of attempting to take care of ourselves in a sick-making, toxic environment, which is all too convenient a scenario for those who benefit from the cruelties and iniquities of the status quo. Another major force in the fading out of the women's health movement is medicalization, the social process by which non-medical problems are converted into medical ones with medical solutions. Medicalization obscures the socio-political roots of physical or mental suffering and thereby deflects collective politicized responses. The anguish that a woman feels as a member of an oppressed class, disenfranchised, traumatized by ongoing male violence, becomes clinical depression, which is explained away as a brain disease. It's her neurons misfiring. There's something wrong with her. Pharmaceuticals are formulated and prescribed, and no one need try to trace the woman's sorrow to any deeper source. Attention is diverted from the social to the biological as ailment's origin, as a biological explanation is manufactured, be it hormonal, genetic, or neurochemical, to make sense of every uncomfortable social reality. Medicalization serves as a potent instrument of depoliticization because, in the Western view, medicine is revered as ahistorical and uncorrupted by social influence rather than being the product of a very specific cultural history, political structure, and ideology. We are enculturated into an excess of faith in biomedicine and the medical-industrial complex, which discourages critical consciousness, stymieing any challenge that we might launch. Shifts within feminist discourse have also contributed to the decline of the women's health movement. Rather than carrying forward the second wave feminist analysis of gender as a patriarchal social construct that privileges men at women's expense, many feminists of the 80s and 90s, particularly in academia, began to define gender as performative, a zone for free play and experimentation, creative self-expression. It becomes something personal and subjective that is oppressive only insofar as an individual is constrained to one gender or the other. The problem, as these feminists outline, is a lack of individual agency with regards to gender. Gender itself is no longer a problem. In fact, it even becomes like a bit of fun, really, for everyone. Feminists who characterized gender as performative and subjective rose to prominence, while the radical feminist renunciation of gender as hierarchical in nature and patriarchal in purpose was shoved to the margins. This shift marks the advent of contemporary gender identity ideology, which has come to dominate feminist discourse today. If medicalization obstructs women's resistance by over-focusing on the biological, gender identity ideology serves the same end, but by opposite means, by rendering biology invisible. Within the logic of gender identity ideology, femaleness is a feeling, it's a state of mind and self-definition, irreducible to anatomy and physiology. To suggest that being female has to do with uteruses, vulvas, vaginas, pregnancy, menstruation, XX chromosomes, whatever, it's unacceptable, an inhumane and conservative gesture which denies the potential femaleness of testicles or maleness of menstruation. A person is female if they feel like it, not female if they don't, or female sometimes, depending on vacillations in their mood. And so to center the female body in feminist organizing ends up looking retrograde at best, and at worst it is bigotry, an attack on others' sense of self. To argue that being born into and living as a female body in a male supremacist society carries with it oppressive repercussions has become an offense punishable by exile and violence. Anything that could be called a women's health movement would by necessity entail reference to biological sex, in how sex relates to women's physical health, as well as to the role of sex in men's unrelenting campaign to control and to exploit specifically female bodies. But the rise of gender identity ideology means that undertaking such a movement's revival requires running the risk of being labeled an enemy of social progress and individual self-actualization. Proponents of gender identity ideology conflate sex and gender. Female implies feminine and male masculine. Though they claim that they're doing something new and revolutionary, this conflation aligns with the traditional and patriarchal notion that sex determines gender. For example, the assumptions that women are by nature nurturing, chatty, fond of ruffles, mascara, etc., as opposed to being assertive leaders. At the same time, to justify the altering of bodies through so-called gender reassignment surgeries, gender identity ideologues must reject equating the female with the feminine in order to support claims that males can be truly female because feminine on the inside, and females truly male. Thus, sex is subordinated to gender. Gender, elected or otherwise mined from the depths of the authentic self, emerges as a reality truer than sex, while the sexed body is denaturalized as merely assigned. Nonetheless, biological sex continues to bear the burden of gender's inscriptions, because it is sexual stereotypes themselves that supply gender with its meanings. Femininity clings to the female body, and so it's best just not to mention sex at all to avoid throwing anyone's identity into question. Sex, if it does not correlate to gender, is disappeared. This confusion is needless, of course, because sex and gender are not one and the same. In fact, the two can be easily disentangled. Sex is biological reality, anatomical, physiological, cellular. A human being is born male or female or intersex, depending on the chromosomes that they've inherited and the play of hormones during their development in utero. They'll develop different organs which have been evolved to serve different functions in human sexual reproduction. Gender, by contrast, is a social construct that divides the human population into two camps, men and women, through the imposition of diametrically opposed expectations, conventions, roles, and destinies meted out on the basis of sex. Gender's social function is to naturalize the patriarchal hierarchy of men over women, male over female. One is born biologically female, that is nature, the indisputable realness of the flesh. A person born female is then gendered feminine and systematically socialized over the course of her life into acquiescing to male domination. That is the socio-political enforcement of patriarchy. The mechanisms of gender socialization, that these mechanisms of gender socialization do exist, and that those who resist conformity to their allotted roles are punished, is proof enough that gender has its origins not in the body, but in the culture. To acknowledge female biology is not to accept biological determinism, the white male supremacist dogma long employed to ground social inequality and bodily difference, justifying disparities between men and women or between white people and black people as the product of nature or God's work, hence immutable and right. Sex, outside of patriarchy, is not destiny. Accepting that sexual differences exist need not reinforce gender dualism, nor does it prohibit anyone, whatever their anatomy, from moving through the world however they please. Sexual difference does not lock anyone into a predetermined, narrowly circumscribed identity, nor does it legitimize male supremacy. It is the social fiction of gender that does those things, narrowing everyone's possibilities while bolstering male power. Here's what acknowledging sex does. It enables us to better understand our female bodies in order that we might improve women's health care so that women everywhere can lead healthier lives. Biological sex is undeniably relevant to human health. It's now common knowledge that there are significant differences between males and females in cardiovascular and autoimmune diseases, and there's the matter of female-specific conditions such as pregnancy or endometriosis, which is often overlooked in trans men by doctors who are pretending that their patients are male. It's crucial, too, that we acknowledge biological sex if we ever hope to understand why and how it is that those of us whose bodies are female continue to be subjugated, exploited, violated, and abused under patriarchy. To deny the material reality of the body and the social significance of sex can only exacerbate our sickness and ossify our oppression. There is no health without the body, no feminism without females. Throughout history, it has been a project of patriarchal societies to replace the natural with the man-made, in order that man might appoint himself nature's master, and thereby elude the natural inevitability of his own mortality. In quest of total control, a man-made world, nature is subordinated to artifice. Gender is consecrated as real, while sex is discarded. The mortal body falls away. It's an assault on reality in service of male dominion, and the consequences are deadly. We cannot live without our bodies. To dismiss biological reality is a hazard not only to women's but to everyone's health, as well as to everyone's liberation, for this dismissal sets us adrift, unmoored from the natural material world and ever more helplessly ensnared in the fictions that sustain patriarchy. The resuscitation of a feminist women's health movement therefore begins with this simple assertion: we are female, our bodies are real. Thank you.
Thanks, Aurora. It was very interesting, but also very fast. I think you needed twice the time to actually introduce us to all of the things you were saying, but, thank you.